There's a kind of heartbreak that no one talks about. Not the pain of being left, but the pain of realizing how far you drifted from yourself while trying to be loved. You didn't just lose them. You lost the version of you that knew how to speak up. The version that had boundaries. The version that didn't beg for crumbs or confuse sacrifice with worth. And when they left or stopped showing up, it hurt. But not just because they were gone. It hurt because you were already empty long before they walked away. It starts subtle. You tone yourself down to be easier to love. You laugh at things that don't feel right. Stay quiet when something cuts too deep. Say yes when everything inside you is screaming no. You think you're being kind, patient, loyal, but what you're really doing is slowly abandoning yourself. Choice by choice, silence by silence, hoping that if you disappear just enough, someone will finally stay. You become who they need, instead of who you are. You predict their moods, walk on eggshells, and twist yourself into someone more acceptable, more palatable. You let your own dreams shrink so theirs can shine. You dim your voice so theirs can be heard. And at first it feels like love. It feels like loyalty. But over time, it starts to feel like erosion. Not all at once, but in small, invisible ways. The kind of loss that doesn't come with grief because it doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in patterns. And what's worse, when they finally go, when the connection fades, or when you're left sitting in the silence you once filled with hope, you blame yourself. You wonder what more you could have done, how much more of yourself you should have given. But the truth is, the biggest betrayal didn't come from them walking away. It came from you walking away from yourself long before they did. This isn't about shame. This is about clarity. Because abandonment doesn't always look like someone leaving you. Sometimes it looks like you constantly leaving yourself, for people, for comfort, for the illusion of connection. And the healing doesn't begin when you finally get them back. It begins when you come back to yourself, fully, fiercely. They never had to say it out loud, you just knew. The moment your emotions made someone uncomfortable, their body language shifted. The sigh, the eye roll, the quiet judgment. You weren't screaming, you weren't dramatic. You were just feeling something real. And that was enough to be labeled as too much. Too emotional, too needy, too reactive. The message was subtle, but it stuck. If you want to be loved, you'd better tone it down. And so, you did. You started measuring your emotions before expressing them. You rehearsed every sentence before you spoke. You became the one who apologized too often, stayed quiet to keep the peace, and smiled when you wanted to scream. Not because you were weak, but because you thought love required performance. You thought connection depended on how well you could suppress your truth to make others comfortable. The world rewards that. People call you mature when you don't cry, low maintenance when you don't ask for anything, and independent when you isolate instead of reaching out. They don't see the cost of becoming that version of you. The nights you swallowed pain in silence, the boundaries you never voiced, the needs you convinced yourself you didn't have. And the saddest part, you started to believe them too. You started to see your sensitivity as a flaw, your intuition as overreaction, your boundaries as selfishness. Somewhere along the way, you mistook emotional abandonment for strength. You called it growth when it was really just survival. Because that's what it feels like, surviving, not living. You go through life half present, showing just enough of yourself to be accepted, but never enough to be fully known. You fear rejection, but more than that, you fear exposure, the raw, vulnerable you that might be dismissed again. And yet, the abandonment still happens. People still leave, or they stay, but only for the curated version of you. The version that smiles, nods, and agrees. The version that doesn't challenge, doesn't need, doesn't speak up. And what could be more painful than that? To be surrounded by people and still feel invisible, not because they're cruel, but because you've hidden the parts of yourself they were meant to love. The truth is, you were never too much. You were just too honest for people who only knew how to pretend, too deep for those who feared their own reflection, too emotionally rich in a world addicted to surface-level connection. And once you realize that, the game changes. You stop auditioning for love. You stop diluting your truth. You stop negotiating your worth, because you finally understand being too much was never the problem. Loving yourself too little was. There's a moment, one that always comes quietly, when you realize you weren't really chasing love. You were running from yourself. Every late-night text, every situationship, and every moment you begged someone to stay. It wasn't about them. It was about filling the silence inside you. Because being alone didn't just mean no one was around. It meant you had to face everything you'd been avoiding, the unhealed wounds, the broken beliefs, the aching questions you kept burying beneath someone else's affection. So you searched for someone to distract you from that silence. Someone who would hold you tight enough to drown out the voices in your head that whispered, "You're not enough. You're hard to love. You'll always be alone." And for a while, their attention worked like medicine. Every reply, every compliment, and every stolen moment of intimacy felt like proof that maybe you were okay. Maybe you were lovable after all. But it never lasted. Because the attention wasn't love, it was a mirror. And every time it cracked, every time they pulled away, it brought you back to the truth you didn't want to face. You hadn't healed. You were still trying to fix yourself through someone else. Still hoping that if they chose you, it would silence the parts of you that hadn't chosen yourself. You poured yourself into others like it was redemption. You made yourself easy, low maintenance, agreeable, not out of kindness, but out of fear. Fear that if you showed even an inch of need, they'd vanish. So instead, you overfunctioned. You gave more than you got. You chased closure in chaos. You confused intensity with intimacy. And you called it love, when it was really just a performance. The irony, the more you chased them, the further you ran from yourself. You lost touch with your voice, your vision, and your values. You sacrificed your peace for the possibility of being chosen. But how can you be chosen when you're not even choosing you? How can someone love you fully when you've made a habit of hiding the parts that feel too much, too emotional, too complicated? And deep down, you knew you weren't being met. You knew your heart was starving. But you stayed, not because it was enough, but because you were afraid of what would surface if you stopped running. Because sitting with yourself meant finally grieving the version of you that was never given the love she deserved. But here's the shift. The moment you stop chasing is the moment you start healing. The moment you stop begging is the moment you start listening, really listening, to what your soul has been trying to say all along. You were never meant to be filled by someone else. You were meant to return to yourself fully. Because the love you've been looking for won't come from being chosen. It will come from finally coming home to you. Loneliness has a reputation for being empty, hollow, quiet. But real loneliness, the kind that aches, is never silent. It echoes, not with the absence of others, but with the absence of you. Because when all the distractions fall away, when no one's texting back, when the noise dies down, what you're left with isn't just solitude, it's a confrontation with yourself. And that's where most people run, because it's in the stillness that the buried things rise, the grief you never named, the boundaries you never enforced, the memories you thought you'd healed. Loneliness becomes the mirror that reflects every piece of you you've been avoiding, the part of you that feels unworthy without validation, the part that craves connection but fears being truly seen, the part that's learned to live as a version of yourself someone else would want. But here's the paradox. That mirror, it's also your doorway back. Because if you can sit in the loneliness without running, if you can face what rises in the quiet, you'll begin to remember who you were before you started begging for scraps. You'll remember the girl who loved with her whole chest, who dreamed out loud, who didn't apologize for needing more. You'll remember the you that existed before performance, before compromise, before shame. It's not about isolating yourself. It's about using the space to finally see the difference between being alone and being abandoned. Because being alone can heal you. It creates room for your thoughts to land, your truth to surface, your heart to recalibrate. And if you've spent your life attaching your worth to how others treat you, being alone is the detox you never knew you needed. It teaches you to ask deeper questions. Not why didn't they stay, but why didn't I? Why didn't I listen to my gut? Why did I call their neglect patience? Why did I settle for attention when what I needed was care? And answering those questions isn't weakness, it's power. Because every honest answer brings you back to your own side. Every moment of self-confrontation becomes an act of self-rescue. Loneliness won't break you, avoidance will. Because what you run from doesn't disappear, it waits. And if you don't meet yourself in the quiet, you'll keep meeting the same wounds in louder places. In relationships that trigger you, in goals that don't fulfill you, in achievements that leave you empty. But when you finally stand in that silence and say, I see you, I hear you, I'm not leaving, something begins to shift. Not outside, inside. The abandonment begins to reverse. And slowly, without fanfare or applause, you start to feel whole again. Not because someone came to save you, but because you finally stopped leaving yourself. You spent so long trying to be chosen, by them, by the world, by anyone who made you feel seen, even for a moment. But the truth is, all that chasing led you further from the only person whose choice ever really mattered, your own. They left, or maybe they stayed in a way that still made you feel alone, and you mourned that deeply. But here's what you missed. Long before anyone else let you down, you let you go. Not out of failure, but out of survival. You learned that silence was safer, that shrinking kept the peace, that losing yourself was the cost of being loved. But now, you know better. And knowing means you get to choose differently. Because healing doesn't happen the moment someone apologizes. It happens the moment you stop abandoning yourself in the hope that someone else will finally show up the way you need them to. You stop outsourcing your worth. You stop romanticizing people who only loved you in fragments. You stop performing and start reclaiming. Reclaiming your voice, your time, your body, your boundaries, your joy. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in quiet, consistent ways. In the way you say no. In the way you leave when it's not safe. In the way you stop negotiating your soul for affection. And here's the truth that will shake the ground you've been walking on. When you finally choose yourself, fully, without compromise, the love you were begging for from others begins to feel small. Because it was never about them. It was about the part of you that believed you needed them to feel whole. You don't. You were always whole, always worthy, always enough. And now, you don't just know it, you live it. So let them call you selfish. Let them say you've changed, because you have. You've stopped abandoning yourself for love. And that's the real return.